London's regenerated Docklands stretches for over 8 square miles on both sides of the River Thames to the east of the city. Although the shiny development at Canary Wharf began in the early 80s, construction of many offices and homes still continues today in lesser-known areas. Our outing is at Rotherhithe and then Wapping, 2 historic districts either side of the river. Dave and I set out from Canada Water tube station, situated on the edge of what was once Canada Dock. Many of the derelict docks have been either filled in, turned into a leisure area, or a nature reserve, like here at Canada Water. The Development Corporation was sympathetic to the Docklands' long and rich history, and pockets of atmospheric artefacts and interesting buildings have been spared demolition, particularly in Rotherhithe. We meet Tim Thomas, a friend of the Brunel Museum here.
This area is the naughty bit of London, and I love it. This is where all the pirates were, this is where all the brothels were, and the ladies who worked in the brothels were known as Winchester geese, because they were all run by the Bishop of Winchester, who had a palace just up the river here. He was the chief pimp. He took a cut off the top. So this is the naughty bit of London. And that's why, you know, there was a time, and I'm sure you've been told this, that your good-looking bird, I'm sure you've been called a good-looking bird, that comes from Winchester geese.
Oh, I didn't know that. Tim, is Rotherhithe a good place to come to for a grand day out?
Oh, absolutely. You've got the river just here, and London really has always been about the river. There are lots of river traffic, things to see. There's the Mayflower pub. It's literally next door to the museum. You've got Sands Films, which is a world-leading place for making historical costumes. They did a lot of the costumes for Pirates of the Caribbean, and they even made a lot of the costumes for the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and that's a beautiful Georgian warehouse.
We'll return to the museum later. First, Dave and I explore on a well-known walking trail along Rotherhithe Street. What appears to be a quaint back street is in fact 2 miles long, the longest street in London. This historic area has long been associated with the maritime industry, and once many wharves and quays lined the River Thames here. There's been a pub around this spot on Rotherhithe Street since the 1550s. The first on record was known as the Ship, and it's been renamed and rebuilt several times over the centuries. Overlooking the river at the rear, this highly popular watering hole stands on a very important historical site. In the 1950s, the rector of St Mary's Church set out to investigate local claims that the famous Mayflower ship actually set out on its historic voyage to America, not from Plymouth, where the history books tell us, but from here, Rotherhithe. He found out that the Mayflower, built in Harwich, was later based in London and was used in the whaling industry and wine trade from France. From entries in the Port of London Customs book, her captain was named as Christopher Jones, a Rotherhithe ship owner. The rector also discovered from his own parish records that the other 3 Mayflower owners and ship's mate Clark were also Rotherhithe men. The Pilgrim Fathers, who were persecuted in England, awaited passage here. It's been reported that in 1620, the then Puritan rector of St Mary's gave them food and refuge in the church before starting their epic journey to preach their faith in the New World. So from this local research, there is little doubt that the famous ship began its historic and eventful journey from right here on this piece of foreshore in July 1620. Of the 65 passengers on board, not all were religious pilgrims. There was an assortment of courageous hopefuls, all members of the Virginia Merchant Adventurers Company. In fact, in order to gain passage on the Mayflower, the Pilgrims had to join this company and became little more than on-board servants during the voyage. This historic site, known as Cumberland Wharf, is remembered with a garden, a curious statue, and an information board telling how the Mayflower began its journey from here. Firstly to Southampton to take on supplies and team up with a troublesome sister ship, and then finally crossing the Atlantic from Plymouth in September with a prosperous wind. And as they say, the rest is history.
It's really tempting to look for something from that time, isn't it?
I know, it's called mudlarking.
That's a good name for it, actually.
Yeah. But you have to have a licence and you have to report it if you find anything, because it could be of archaeological importance.
It's a shame, isn't it?
Well, it's such a historic river.
Yeah, you can't take it home.
No. This part of the Thames, of course, is tidal. Today, a more serious mudlarking team from the Museum of London have a couple of hours to investigate and record this historic foreshore before the water rises. This wonderful piece of slimy carpentry is a windlass from a sailing ship. You can survey all this from the relaxing terrace of the Mayflower pub. Inside, there are constant reminders of the iconic ship and its famous voyage. Not surprisingly, there are many visitors here from the USA. Interestingly, this is the only pub we know of licensed to sell postage stamps for the UK and the US. Back in the 1800s, when the pub was called the Spread Eagle, seafarers docking at Rotherhithe had little time to spare, let alone post a letter, but they were able to order food, a pint, and a postage stamp here. You can still ask for one at the bar today. You have to wonder how many times within these walls tales have been told of the little ship of just 180 tons that battled across the Atlantic carrying the Pilgrim Fathers. But what of the Mayflower's captain, Christopher Jones? Rotherhithe had two social centres at that time, the pub and the church. The parish records tell a sad story. He died at the age of just 52. So in 1622, Jones was finally laid to rest somewhere here in what was the old churchyard, less than 2 years after the historic voyage of the Mayflower. Although there isn't a gravestone left to see, there is a memorial and a plaque in the church. Another landmark in the area is the Rotherhithe Tunnel under the Thames. Opened in 1908, very much in the heyday of the former Docklands, it was originally intended for horse-drawn traffic. But progress couldn't be halted, and it steadily became overrun with motor vehicles, and is still heavily congested today. Now, this wasn't the first tunnel under the Thames. Much earlier, in the 19th century, a brave project began. The road names and signs in Rotherhithe give you a clue to who engineered the masterpiece. Close to the Mayflower Inn, there is a private museum dedicated to its constructors.
Very near here, in fact beneath my feet, you've got the first tunnel under a river anywhere in the world, built between 1825 and 1843. And the building behind me was the pumping station that they used to pump the water out. And the tunnel under my feet was built by a genius called Mark Isambard Brunel, the father of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, probably the greatest engineer in the world. At that time, the Thames was so congested. On any one day of the week, you would have found at least 3,000 tall-masted cargo ships desperately trying to land cargo at the right place. And there was also a lot of piracy believe it or not. More piracy here than there was in the Caribbean. It was chaos. And so Mark Isambard came up with this genius plan of building a tunnel under a river, big enough to take horses and carts to carry cargo from one side of the river to the other, get it to the right place. They would charge a penny a load. It wouldn't add to the congestion, and they reckoned they could make a profit. And so in order to do that, he had to kind of rewrite all the rules of engineering. For example, on my right here is what we call the Grand Entrance Hall. And that was the shaft that they sank to build the tunnel. You have to go down to the level where you want to do your tunnelling. The first caisson shaft ever sunk in the world. Now, they set about building the tunnel, but they had all sorts of problems. At one point, they ran out of money quite early on, and young Isambard King de Brunel, and it was his first job working under his father, aged 19, came up with a publicity stunt. He invited all the richest people in London to come to an event in the tunnel. And in the tunnel was the band of the Grenadier Guards playing God Save the King, and they were amazed that they were going to have a banquet under the River Thames. It raised the money. The other reason it took so long is there was a constant fear of flooding. And on one notorious occasion, 3 men had drowned, and they were fearful that Isambard King de Brunel, the son of the overall boss, had also drowned. But luckily for him, at the last minute, the foreman of the day, his best friend, came through at the top of the shaft, looked down, and suddenly the whole shaft was full of water. And on the surface, as it surged up, was Isambard King de Brunel, unconscious. The foreman grabbed him by the arm, pulled him to safety, but the young man already had a lungful of Thames water, which in those days was no joke. And for the rest of his life, he had chest complaints because of that one incident. But the first thing he had done, he was rowed out to the middle of the River Thames. This is Isambard, the son. He was put in a diving bell. He was lowered down to the bed of the river. He looked around. He found the hole where the water was coming in. He put sandbags in the hole and he fixed it. They pulled him back out. But he was ill, I can tell you.
Tim, what can we see in the museum?
In the pumping station, which is now the main museum, on the top floor, you've got basically a history of the making of the tunnel. They planned to do it in 3 years. It took 18 years because, first of all, they kept running out of money, and secondly, there was a constant fear of flooding. But they managed to achieve what they set out to after 18 years. So on the top floor, you've got a history of that. A totally revolutionary, an epoch-making piece of engineering.
Amongst the display of commemorative merchandise for the 8th wonder of the world is a curious peep show. Fascinating.
Beneath, you've got a film running about the life of the son, Isambard King de Brunel, the greatest engineer who ever lived. He built ships, railways, he built the lot. And just a little bit further down the river from here, Isambard King de Brunel, at the end of his life, launched a ship called the SS Great Eastern, 5 times bigger than any ship that had ever been built before. And it was so big, 700 feet long, they couldn't launch it across the river because one end would have hit the far bank before the back was free. So they had to launch it sideways. It got stuck. There was an explosion, he had a heart attack, and they took him home, and that's when he died, aged 53. So he never saw the launching of the Great Eastern. But in the lower floor, you've got a pictorial representation of that. In the shaft itself, you can go down halfway down the shaft, but they put a floor in a couple of years ago, and now we have events there. I give talks down there. We've had concerts down there. I don't know if you're interested, but I sing in a band, and we've done gigs down there, and the acoustics are wonderful. On the top of this shaft here, there is a beautiful garden. And at weekends, you can come to what's called the Midnight Apothecary, which is a cocktail bar, a pop-up cocktail bar.
Now, what many Londoners don't know is that this famous 175-year-old tunnel is still in use today. In 1869, it was converted to carry the East London Railway. Nowadays, on what is now the London Overground line, around 14 million passengers travel through it each year. Many don't even realise it. Now it's our turn to go underneath the Thames, although Dave thinks overground isn't quite the right word for it. You don't get long to experience the eighth wonder of the world. It's just 1,300 feet long, running at a depth of 75 feet below the river at high tide. The historic importance of the tunnel was recognised in 1995 when this amazing feat was listed as a Grade 2 monument. We alight at the historic station of Wapping, just one stop north of Rotherhithe. However, the platform is a bit short. You have to be careful which carriage you travel in.
It looks like it's leaking.
No, it can't be, can it?
Wapping Station was built inside the original north access shaft and was refurbished about 10 years ago to show off the amazing brick construction from the past.
It's still hard to believe that the 175-year-old tunnel carries thousands upon thousands of people every day. It's a real testament to the Brunel's extraordinary engineering.
Now we walk out into Wapping High Street, a different part of London's Docklands, where there are many large warehouses full of apartments and offices, some well established, some quite recent restorations. Dave assures me that the best history is in all the pubs on this side of the Thames, so we make a beeline for one of the oldest in London, the Prospect of Whitby, currently named after a ship from the Tyne, which used to moor here in the early 19th century. But the pub is far older than that. In fact, it lays claim to being the site of the oldest riverside tavern in London, dating from around 1520. So, 400 years ago perhaps, from here you could have seen the Mayflower sailing up the Thames. The pub was once known as the Pelican, and access to the waterfront was down a narrow set of steps or stairs. These were once watermen's stairs, where passengers might get picked up or dropped off, seeking transport across or along the Thames. There are several of them preserved in Wapping. The tide is still out, so we can explore.
This rather gruesome sight is of course a recent addition to the shore, but it's still a reminder of Execution Dock near here, which was used for over 400 years to execute pirates, smugglers and mutineers, all sentenced to death by the Admiralty Court.
Tradition was upheld that their bodies would be left dangling until they had been submerged 3 times by the tide. It makes you shudder. Close to the Prospect of Whitby is the Shadwell Basin. It's now one of the most significant bodies of water surviving from the historic London docks. Many, of course, have been filled in. The basin lay derelict from the late 1960s, but by 1987 the London Docklands Development Corporation commissioned a waterside complex here. The residential buildings are 3 to 5 stories, echoing the scale of traditional 19th century dockside warehouses. Dave and I make our way back into historic Wapping.
Garnet Street, now that rings a bell. Do you remember that TV comedy, Till Death Us Do Part?
Yeah, that was set in Wapping, wasn't it?
Yeah. Johnny Spate, the writer, must have named Alf Garnet after the street.
Yeah. He was a bit non-PC, wasn't he?
He was the most non-PC person ever. You know, when the series was made, this was all a deprived area of London's Docklands.
Yeah, look at it now. Flats are worth millions.
I know, but I like the way they've kept all the original ironwork and stuff.
Quite peaceful now and certainly gentrified, Wapping was not so in the 1980s. As part of the redevelopment of this area, News International's newspaper operation moved from their traditional Fleet Street headquarters to new £80 million premises in Wapping. Over 5,000 print workers were sacked when new technology was introduced. Violent trade union protests followed, and the incident became known as the Battle of Wapping. Romantics prefer to remember a much earlier past, imagining the old warehouses that were stuffed full of spice, fruit, nuts, oils, wine, hops and tea. Apparently the dock workers and sailors used to be able to tell exactly where they were at night just by the smell of the produce. Expecting to be steered into another pub, Dave mentions that this one is in fact a 1980s establishment, but built inside an historic warehouse. Captain Kidd is named after one of history's most notorious plunderers, William Kidd, who was eventually hanged hereabouts at the notorious gallows, Execution Dock. And so our trail in the Docklands ends here at, yes, another pub next to another historic flight of stairs, the town of Ramsgate. Formerly named after a barmaid here, the Red Cow was a known watering hole for a certain Judge Jeffreys in the 17th century. A confirmed royalist, he went into hiding when the parliamentarian revolt overthrew King James II.
The infamous hanging Judge Jeffreys, who'd been known to sentence 200 people to death in one sitting, had a last drink in the pub before attempting to flee to Europe by ship. He was grabbed by a lynch mob on Wapping Old Stairs in 1688.
From here, he was taken to the Tower of London for his own safety. And there he died a year later, aged 40, not by execution, but reputedly from a painfully large kidney stone brought on by excessive drinking. There are many more gruesome tales to discover in London's historic Docklands. Next, we head for somewhere with a more civilised